I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years.
J.R.R. Tolkien claimed to find in his poetry one of the most profound expressions of mature spiritual experience, and declared that it had a profound influence on his own writing.
I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind.
In 1912, in one of the first major studies of the poem, John Francis O'Connor wrote this: "The name is strange, but when one reads the poem, this strangeness disappears. The meaning is understood."
And in the mist of tears I hid from him, and under running laughter.
In the eulogy after his death, G.K. Chesterton simply concluded, "He was a great poet."
Up visted hopes I sped, and shot precipitated down titanic glooms of chasmed fears from those strong feet that followed after.
On a cold London day in February 1887, Wilfred Mennell, the editor of the literary magazine Merry England, received a strange parcel in the post. Inside, he found an essay and a small collection of poems written on tattered paper and covered with dirt and grime. Attached was a note that said,
I must ask your pardon for the soiled state of the manuscript. It is due not to slovenliness, but to the strange places and circumstances under which it has been written.
The note was signed Francis Thompson. There was no return address.
I'd love to have been a fly on the wall when they met, because Thompson was living on the streets. He was a complete derelict. But he had sent some writing into my great-grandfather's magazine. And then for various reasons, there'd been confusion. They hadn't managed to meet up. And so Mennell published some work of Francis Thompson's and invited him then to come and meet him.
A short time later, Mennell received a letter from Thompson thanking him with a return address listed at a chemist shop on London's Drury Lane.
When Meynell went to inquire, the chemist informed him that the author was a man who'd fallen on hard times and was living on the street selling matches to buy food and laudanum, the prescription form of opium which was prescribed as a medicine at the time. Well, Meynell paid off the remaining debt and expressed his desire that Thompson might come to visit him in person.
And so Mennell, wearing a suit in his offices, and in is brought this complete derelict, skeletal character who has no shirt on under his jacket. He's been persuaded to do up his jacket so as not to show the fact he's not got a shirt on. He probably is extremely unwashed. He's got no socks, and he's been terrified. He's already tried to escape a couple of times and been persuaded to come back in. And they greet each other not as long-lost friends, but with huge mutual respect.
In time, Mennell and his wife befriended the broken man and nursed him back to health. And little by little, he shared his story with them.
He began to tell them about his past and his background. He was born in a devout Catholic family in the northwest of England in the town of Preston on December the 18th, 1859, a week before Christmas. And a few days after his birth, as was customary, he was christened in this church of St. Ignatius in Preston, a neo-Gothic church built in the 1830s. And from the earliest days, Thompson showed a love for literature, a desire to write stories and poetry, but these literary sensibilities were not shared by his family. His father was a doctor, and Thompson's love for literature was not really part of something that he got much sympathy for at home.
Although his father was a doctor, neither of his parents looked upon poetry as a vocation that a person might actually pursue.
Thompson, throughout his life, was going to be an outsider in many different ways, and he was, as a birth Catholic, part of a minority. And in order to get a serious academic education, he was sent away to another county, another northern county, to Durham, to Arshaw College, which had started off as a seminary. It had very famous pupils there, including Cardinal Wiseman. And he went there and tested his vocation as a young man, but it was decided that that was not to be his life.
In June 1877, the Thompsons received a letter from the president of Usher, which read,
I have been most reluctantly compelled to concur in the opinion of his director and others that it is not the holy will of God that he should go on for the priesthood. It is quite time that he should begin to prepare for some other career.
And so after Francis graduated from Usher College, he returned home to his family, and he himself had no real idea what his calling in life was.
So after Francis graduated from Usher, he moved back home to an uncertain future and to a family that did not quite know what to do with him.
Francis Thompson's family were entirely supportive in general terms, but they had the idea that he would become a doctor like his father. And so he went to medical school, Owens College, I think it was called, and he couldn't quite hack it. He kept trying, and he was very, very conscious of disappointing his parents. He wasn't at all cavalier about it, but they must all have realized over the years of his failures that this wasn't going to happen.
At Usher, Francis frequently took first in English and essay writing, but in mathematics, he ranked last. So while his Latin and Greek skills were excellent, for everything else required of a medical student, he was clearly a misfit.
He couldn't deal with just normal daily things like catching a train or posting a letter, which you would rather need that sort of competence if you're going to be a doctor or a priest.
During Thompson's enrollment at Owens, he became ill, and following a long bout with fever, was prescribed laudanum.
Well, when we talk about opium in 19th century Britain, what we're really talking about is laudanum. Laudanum was the definitive, really, preparation of opium. People didn't smoke it in Britain. They took it in a liquid form. Laudanum in the modern sense, if I can call it modern, comes in the 1660s. A man called Thomas Sydenham, very eminent physician of the day, dissolved opium in sweet wine or sherry. And after that, people really never looked back.
At the time, this medicinal form of opium was given to patients suffering from a variety of ailments, as it helped relieve many symptoms.
Opium, I think, was tremendously popular in the 19th century, partly because it was one of the few medicines they had then that actually worked. It was useful for coughing-type diseases, quieten down chest aggravation and things like tuberculosis. It would stop things like dysentery. Obviously, it was the greatest painkiller ever known. It really worked, and they embraced it enormously.
Its addictive properties were not fully recognized until later, when its sale and use became strictly regulated.
In 1879, Francis Thompson failed his medical exams, and he failed them again in 1881 and for a third and final time in 1884. After leaving Owens College, there were several unsuccessful attempts in holding down a job, which led to rising tensions with his father. And following one of these arguments with his father, he decided to go to London. His sister woke up one morning to see a note from him on her dressing table saying that he'd gone to London. He could have had no idea at all, however, the life of destitution that awaited for him once he arrived there.
Bearing only 2 books, a few extra pieces of clothing, and little money, Thompson arrived in London on a cold December day in 1885, a few days short of his 26th birthday.
So he persuaded his parents that he should become a writer and that he would go to London to do this. And they were supportive in the sense that they arranged for an allowance to be paid for him each week. But he then wasn't quite competent enough to go and collect it, hence his destitution.
Thompson had left home hoping to pursue what he believed was his true vocation of being a writer. Now to support himself, he passed through a series of odd jobs, each more desperate than the one before. He delivered orders for a London bookseller first, then he worked as assistant in a boot shop. He held horses while their owners got off and on, and finally sold matches in the street.
As his meager supply of money disappeared in London, so did his food and lodging. Eventually, he ended up sleeping in a shelter for the destitute, in vacant alleys, under arches, or with the city's homeless on the Thames embankment.
He saw the modern hell of London there, and so he was immersed despite the fact that he had this very marginal upbringing in the provinces in a Catholic family, he was suddenly thrust into the pit. And as it were, juxtaposing that experience, the trauma of that experience, with his spiritual imagination, this was the assault, this was the terrible experience that this poem confronts head on. And of course, it manages to reconcile, it manages to achieve a redemptive narrative from that confrontation.
I think if you look at the great stories that have ever been told, and certainly the great stories that show us something of the gospel story, they're always stories that come out of brokenness and pain, people who have been lost and discovered what it means to be found. I can relate to that and even relate to the experience of Francis Thompson in my own family as I look back over the generations and see people who were caught up in addictions, who were destitute, who were out on the streets, and yet the grace of God in Jesus Christ met them where they were.
Years later, Thompson would describe this turning point in his life.
With a few shillings to give me breathing space, I began to put together the half-obliterated rough manuscript. I came simultaneously to my last page and last halfpenny and went forth to drop off the parcel. The next day I spent the halfpenny on 2 boxes of matches and again began the struggle for life.
During the day, Francis took refuge in the Guildhall Library until his ragged clothes became so filthy and threadbare, he was asked not to return. It was during this time, to save the cost of postage, he finally dropped that small sample of writing into the Merry England letterbox there at 43 Essex Street, along with a letter he had written, dated February 23rd, 1887.
Menel's daughter, Viola, recounts the lifelong relationship that slowly blossomed.
When Thompson was asked to write more and to accept a small weekly sum for subsistence, he refused the help. But the invitation to write was for him like a possible key to true life, and my father's friendliness had made its mark. Mr. Thompson came again to the office, and at that time subjects for Merry England articles were discussed.
After much persuasion, Meynell convinced Thompson of the necessity of seeing a doctor. And ironically, the doctor, first of all, stated that Thompson was not destined to live for much longer, but also that if his body was deprived of the opium to which it was addicted, it might actually hasten his death. But in spite of this, Meynell and Thompson decided that the risk was necessary, and he entered a private hospital. Even though the stay in hospital was successful in getting Thompson off of his laudanum use, it left him a shell of a man emotionally and physically and mentally. And it was thought that if he returned to the streets of London, he would take up the laudanum habit again. And the decision was made to bring him here to Storrington Priory, where he could be kept under the watchful eye of the monastic brothers while he fully recuperated and recovered from his addiction.
Meynell hoped the devoted monks and wholesome countryside might be able to assist the frail poet to gradually regain his strength and health. In his first letter to his benefactor, Thompson made no attempt to hide the fact that his dark cravings had accompanied him to Storrington.
Dear Mr. Meynell, with regard to my illness, there is nothing to be alarmed about. It is severer and more obstinate than I had hoped would be the case, but is a mere matter of holding on. I have hopes that the thing may gradually be loosening its hold upon me. I think I shall like this place when I begin again to like anything. I keep on my legs and force myself to go out as much as possible.
The forced abstinence at Storrington had an even greater effect on Thompson than he or Meynell ever dared hope. As he walked the pastoral South Downs with more and more vigor, Francis began to find himself spontaneously breaking into song. Now that the laudanum no longer imprisoned him inside his own inner land of dreams, his poetry began to pour out onto the pages.
Francis Thompson was welcomed here when he was in difficulty, having problems in his life, and he was really helped through that critical point of his life. And while here, he wrote the poem, The Hound of Heaven.
It was while breathing the invigorating air of the Storrington countryside and surrounded and uplifted by the monk's cycle of prayers and readings from the Psalms and the Gospels that Thompson would write his greatest and most beloved work, The Hound of Heaven.
The continuing vitality of The Hound of Heaven is a feature, I think, of why it's become, in that loose sense of the word, such a classic, because it does apply on so many different levels to so many case histories. It is a modern poem. It's a poem that we can still live, as it were. It's an experience, a spiritual experience, which is archetypal. And to a certain extent, perhaps most of us live through it at different times.
I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind.
These lines portray an image, impossible to forget, of the great Hound of Heaven.
In the poem, Thompson depicts the great love affair between God and the soul. And he echoes the psalmist's cry, "Where shall I go from thy spirit? Where shall I flee from thy presence?"
A voice tells the person who is fleeing,
All things betray thee, who betrayest me.
no matter where he seeks, nothing will satisfy him. Like Augustine before him, the poet finally comes to see that he will find no rest until he rests in God.
All which I took from thee, I did but take, not for thy harms, but just that thou mightst seek it in my arms.
Finally, the person learns, as do all the readers of the poem, that the one pursuing him all this time was the object of his longing.
I am he whom thou seekest. Rise, clasp my hand, and come.
The Hound of Heaven is autobiographical, insofar as it tells Thompson's own story of being lost, utterly lost, and finally found by the Hound of Heaven. But it's also a universal story, because it tells of a loving God in heaven, the Good Shepherd, who pursues each one of us, each abandoned soul, and does not forsake us, even the most wayward soul.
5 months after moving back to London near the Mennels in 1890, The Hound of Heaven appeared in Merry England. Thompson's masterpiece would reach an even wider audience when it was included in his first poetry book, simply titled Poems, in 1893.
The Hound of Heaven is the storyline for the whole of his works. In some ways, it lays the paradigm story that all his poetry tells in different levels. What seems horrific, what seems menacing, what seems to be something to be fled from is actually what he was questing for all the time. So he turns, as it were, to face an opponent and finds the embrace of God at the end.
Over the next 17 years, Thompson continued to publish both poetry and literary essays, with the Mennels' continued caring friendship.
I think the connection was that Mennel, he was a writer. He was a perfectly competent writer himself, but essentially he was an editor, publisher, encourager of writers. And he was always on the lookout for fine writing, and he'd found it in his wife in the first instance. And then when he saw Francis Thompson's writing, before meeting him, he thought, this is somebody special. And from then on, he felt that it was his role to make sure that Francis Thompson had as few obstacles as possible put in his way and was as encouraged as possible to write wonderful things.
The great Christian poets have a rare and precious gift because they can present the world and the gospel to us in ways that we've never seen it before. You see that in John Donne, in George Herbert, in Gerard Manley Hopkins, in Francis Thompson. I think in our culture, we think of poetry as something inaccessible and hard to understand, but when it's well written, it's actually accessible and ready to understand. We really were made for poetry. I think the fact that the Bible is almost half poetry is a good hint that we were made for poetry.
Now, in all his poetry, he's trying to reconcile opposites, innocence and experience, at different levels. But he's also trying to find a voice that will reconcile the discrepancies from different romantic poetry, the liturgy, and from different areas of poetic tradition. And he gradually accepts, as Chesterton says, the voice of orthodoxy. Increasingly, in his poetry, he becomes more and more what Chesterton calls ecclesiastical. Oscar Wilde had a great admiration for Francis Thompson's poetry, and he thought, in a way, that Thompson could do it so much better than he could.
Although his masterpiece, The Hound of Heaven, would live on long after he was gone and touch the hearts and lives of countless readers all over the world, Francis Thompson himself has been all but forgotten in the country that birthed this poetic genius. In his hometown of Preston, only a small marker hangs on his childhood home to commemorate his life.
And it does again seem odd that you have this small town on the edge of Manchester, Preston, in Lancashire, mill town, old industrial town, that has this great hero from amongst their own, one of their own sons, that the people of Preston know absolutely nothing about. It really does show sort of the lack of knowledge, the lack of respect, the lack of reverence for the past and their heritage of the nation, its Christian heritage and its artistic heritage.
Thompson died of tuberculosis on the night of November 13th, 1907, in St. John's and Elizabeth's Hospital, London. He was 47. Today, in a crowded London cemetery, lays a small tomb, overgrown with ivy, easily missed by visitors.
You imagine in America that when you visit a poet that's known all over the world, people have read, especially his classic poem, Hound of Heaven, for decades in schools and churches. It's in poetry books everywhere. You think that when you'd go to the cemetery where he's buried, there'd be something special there. The opposite is true. His grave is unkept, overgrown, thrown in with all the others, and truth be told, almost impossible to find. We had to really search for it.
I actually found it very symbolically sad and significant that this great poet, one of the great Victorian poets, was utterly neglected by his own country. What does it say about England's complete disregard and disrespect for the great souls that she's produced? That you have a grave, itself a work of art, with this wonderful symbolism on the tombstone, completely and utterly ignored, rejected and neglected by his own people.
Despite the decay to its facade, the tomb tells the story of Thompson's own life.
The stone monument over Francis Thompson's grave was erected by the Mennells. At one end, we see the laurel wreath intertwined with the crown of thorns. And on top of the tomb, running its entire length, we see a cross slightly raised. These three emblems, the crown of thorns, the laurel wreath, and the cross, reconcile and signify his suffering, his success, but also finally his surrender to the Hound of Heaven himself.
The gravestone, partly blocked from view by an adjacent marker added years later, has two inscriptions. Francis Thompson, 1859 to 1907. Beneath it is engraved the poet's own line, written years earlier in a poem to his infant godson.
Look for me in the nurseries of heaven.